Magnus the Quiet had lived alone for 15 years, convinced his massive size made him unsuitable for love. At 40, the giant warrior had accepted his solitude, until a desperate widow knocked on his door during a snowstorm. Sometimes the person who needs you most arrives exactly when you've stopped believing anyone could. Magnus, the Quiet, Eriksson had given up on love long before his 40th winter arrived like an unwelcome guest. At 6 feet 8 inches, with shoulders broad enough to carry a full-grown elk and hands that could crush stone, he was a giant among men, but when it came to matters of the heart, he felt smaller than a field mouse. For 15 years, he had lived alone in his timber hall deep in the Norwegian forests, where the pine trees grew so thick they blocked out the midday sun. The villagers of Greystone, half a day's journey through the winding forest paths, spoke of him in hushed whispers. Some remembered the young warrior who could cleave a shield in two with a single blow, whose battle cry could freeze the blood in enemy veins. Others knew only the stories, tales that grew more fearsome with each telling. They called him Magnus the Quiet now, not for any peaceful nature, but because he had chosen silence over the roar of combat, solitude over the complexities of human connection. His hall stood like a fortress against the endless wilderness, its walls thick enough to muffle not just the howling wind, but the loneliness that had become his constant companion. Inside, Magnus moved through his morning routine with the precision of a man who had lived alone too long to remember spontaneity. The fire needed stoking, 3 logs split evenly placed just so. The porridge required stirring, 20 turns clockwise, then 10 against the grain. Each task performed in silence, each movement deliberate and solitary. Above the stone hearth hung his battle axe, its blade still sharp despite years of disuse. The weapon seemed to watch him as he worked, a reminder of the man he used to be before he chose this exile. Magnus had been 25 when he last swung that axe in anger, 25 when he walked away from the life of a warrior and disappeared into these woods. The reason for his retreat wasn't cowardice or defeat in battle, it was something far more painful and personal. Magnus had never known a woman's touch, never felt the warmth of someone who chose to stay rather than flee from his intimidating presence. In the warrior's hall, surrounded by men who boasted of their conquests and spoke casually of wives and lovers, Magnus had learned to keep his inexperience hidden like a shameful secret. At 25, when other men his age were already fathers with established households, Magnus was still the giant virgin who made women cross to the other side of the street rather than pass near him. His size, which served him so well in battle, became a curse in matters of love. Potential brides saw only the intimidating warrior, never the gentle soul beneath. The final humiliation had come at a harvest festival, when Ingrid the Fair, the blacksmith's daughter he had admired from afar for 3 long years, had laughed openly when her friends suggested Magnus as a potential suitor. "That giant?" she had said loud enough for half the village to hear. "I'd rather marry a bear. At least a bear wouldn't crush me on our wedding night." The laughter that followed had burned worse than any battle wound. That night, Magnus had packed his few possessions and walked into the forest, vowing never again to subject himself to such humiliation. 15 years later, his routine was carved as deeply as the notches he made in his doorframe to mark the passing seasons. Dawn brought wood chopping, the rhythmic bite of his axe into pine and oak filling the morning air. Midday meant checking his traps, following paths through the undergrowth that only he knew. Evenings were for mending, the small repairs that kept his isolated world functioning. But on this particular evening, as October frost began to silver the edges of fallen leaves, his carefully ordered existence shattered with 3 sharp knocks on his heavy wooden door. Magnus froze mid-stir, his wooden spoon suspended above the pot of rabbit stew. In 15 years no one had knocked on his door. Traders called out from a safe distance, leaving their goods at the forest edge. Village officials sent messengers who shouted their business from beyond the clearing. The sound came again, knock, 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 firm but not aggressive, the rap of knuckles that expected an answer. "Who disturbs my hall?" he called out, his voice rusty from disuse. "A woman seeking shelter from the cold and those who would do her harm," came the reply. The voice was clear and strong, tinged with weariness but not fear. "I bring no threat to your peace, only need for warmth until the storm passes." Magnus' hand hovered over the iron latch. In all his years of isolation, no woman had ever approached his hall. The stories the villagers told were enough to keep even the boldest at bay. Yet here stood someone who either hadn't heard the tales or chose to ignore them. He pulled the door open slowly, revealing a figure wrapped in a heavy woolen cloak, snow dusting her shoulders like flour. She was not young, perhaps 35 winters, with auburn hair showing threads of silver at the temples. Her face was round and pleasant, marked by laugh lines and the kind of weariness that came from long travel. Magnus realized with something approaching relief, exactly the opposite of what the village boys typically call beautiful. She was broad where maidens were narrow, solid where they were delicate, marked by life where they were smooth with youth. But her eyes were the color of deep water, steady and unafraid as they met his gaze. "You're larger than the stories tell," she said matter-of-factly, stamping snow from her worn boots. "May I enter?" "The cold grows bitter." Magnus stepped aside, still too surprised to speak. She moved past him into the warmth of the hall, unwinding her cloak to reveal a sturdy traveling dress the color of autumn leaves. At her belt hung a small knife and a leather pouch that clinked softly as she moved. "You keep a tidy home," she observed, hanging her cloak on a peg beside the door as if she belonged there. "And something smells good. Rabbit, if I'm not mistaken." "Who are you?" he finally managed. "Astrid Bjornsdottir," she said, moving toward the fire to warm her hands. "Widowed twice over, mother of children grown and scattered like seeds on the wind. And you are Magnus the Quiet, though they might have called you Magnus the Tall and been more accurate." He studied her as she warmed herself, noting how she positioned herself with clear sight lines to both door and window, the habits of someone who had learned caution the hard way. Around her neck, almost hidden beneath her dress, he glimpsed a simple wooden ring hanging from a leather cord. "How do you know my name?" "Stories travel even to those who try to outrun them," she said, turning to face him. "The villagers in Greystone speak of the giant who lives in the deep woods, who once was a great warrior but chose the hermit's life. What they say is true. I prefer my solitude." Astrid smiled then, an expression that transformed her weather-worn features. "Well then, we're both disappointing people today. They said I was a fool to seek you out, that you'd as likely kill me as give me shelter. Yet here you are, neither murdering me nor throwing me back into the storm." Despite himself, Magnus felt his lips twitch toward something that might have been a smile. "The night is young." "Ah," he makes jest. "Perhaps there's hope for conversation yet." She moved toward the pot of stew, breathing in the aroma. "When did you last eat a meal you didn't cook yourself?" "I prefer my own cooking." Spoken like a man who's never had anyone else to cook for him. She looked around the hall again, taking in the neat but sparse furnishings, the absence of any feminine touch or family comfort. "May I tend your stew? It's a fair trade for the warmth." Before he could protest, she had taken the wooden spoon and begun stirring with practiced motions. She tasted it, nodded approvingly, then moved to his small store of herbs and seasonings without asking permission. A pinch of this, a handful of that, transforming the simple rabbit stew into something that filled the hall with rich, complex aromas. "You have skill," he admitted grudgingly. "I've had practice. 2 husbands, for children, and more hungry mouths at my table than I can count over the years. A woman learns to make much from little." As she worked, Magnus found himself studying her movements, the economical grace of someone accustomed to managing a household, the subtle way she favored her left foot that suggested old injury, the calluses on her hands that spoke of hard work rather than soft living. "Why are you here, Astrid Bjornsdottir? Truly?" She set the spoon aside and turned to face him fully, her expression growing serious. "I am running from dangerous men. My late husband's brother claims rights over me and my property that I refuse to acknowledge." When words failed to move me, he began making threats. "What manner of threats?" "The kind that made me pack only what I could carry and slip away in the night rather than face them directly." She gestured toward the window where snow continued to fall. "I've been traveling for weeks, staying ahead of pursuit, but winter comes early this year. I need shelter, and I heard stories of a warrior who valued solitude above all else. I thought perhaps you might understand the desire to be left alone." Magnus considered her words. He had indeed chosen isolation, but his reasons were rooted in shame and loneliness rather than danger. Yet something in her steady gaze, her practical acceptance of her circumstances, stirred a protectiveness he hadn't felt in years. "You may stay until the storm passes," he said finally. "But I warn you, I'm not good company. I've lived alone too long to remember the ways of conversation." "Then it's fortunate I have enough conversation for both of us," she replied with that warm smile. "And in return for your hospitality, I'll earn my keep. These hands know work, and I suspect a man living alone has tasks that go undone for want of time or inclination." As if to prove her point, she began clearing the small table where he took his meals, wiping it clean with efficient movements. The simple act of being served a meal in his own hall felt strange and somehow significant, like a ritual he had forgotten he was missing. They ate in relative quiet, but it was not the oppressive silence of his solitary meals. Instead, it felt like the comfortable quiet of two people who understood that words were not always necessary. When she complimented the rabbit, tender, well-trapped, he found himself explaining his snare techniques. When he noticed her favoring her left foot, she told him of the blister she'd earned from days of walking in worn boots. As the evening deepened and the storm showed no sign of abating, Astrid began to tell him about her children. Eric, her eldest, who had sailed west to seek his fortune. Helga, her daughter, who had married well and blessed her with grandchildren she had never met. The younger boys, who had followed opportunities north and now served in the household of a wealthy jarl. They write when they can, she said, her fingers unconsciously touching the wooden ring at her throat. But the world is wide and children must make their own paths. I do not fault them for seeking lives far from the shadows of their mother's troubles. You speak of troubles. Her expression grew careful. Every woman who has lived past her youth has troubles, Magnus. The question is whether she lets them define her or merely inform her choices. He wanted to ask more, but something in her manner suggested the conversation had reached its natural boundary for the evening. Instead, he rose and began banking the fire for the night. You may take my bed, he said. I will sleep by the hearth. I would not put you from your own rest. The floor by the fire will suit me well enough. No. The word came out more forcefully than he intended, surprising them both. He softened his tone. A guest should not sleep on the floor. I've slept in worse places than before a warm fire. She studied his face for a moment, then nodded. You are kind, Magnus the quiet. Kinder than the stories told. As she prepared for sleep, Magnus arranged his blankets on the floor and listened to the sounds of another person sharing his space. The rustle of fabric, the soft padding of feet on packed earth, the gentle sigh as she settled into his bed, all of it strange and somehow comforting after so many years of silence. Magnus. Her voice came soft from the darkness. Yes. Thank you. For the shelter, for the meal, for treating a stranger with dignity. There are few enough men in this world who offer such gifts without expecting payment in return. He lay silent for a long moment, staring up at the rafters where shadows danced in the dying firelight. Sleep well, Astrid Bjorn's daughter. Tomorrow we will see what the dawn brings. But as he listened to her breathing slow and deepen into sleep, Magnus found rest elusive. For the first time in 15 years he was not alone in his hall. For the first time in longer than that, he found himself wondering what it might be like to share his solitary life with another soul, even temporarily. The thought should have disturbed him, should have reinforced his desire for isolation. Instead, as the storm raged outside and snow piled against his walls, he discovered that the presence of this unexpected woman brought not disruption, but a peace he had not known he was missing. Dawn broke gray and cold, the storm having passed in the night but leaving behind a world transformed by snow. Magnus woke to unfamiliar sounds, the soft rustle of someone moving quietly about his hall, trying not to disturb his rest. He lay still for a moment, listening to Astrid as she rekindled the fire and set water to boil. When he rose and folded his blankets, she greeted him with a nod and a steaming cup of pine needle tea sweetened with honey from his small store. You sleep quietly for such a large man, she observed. I feared I might wake you with my morning routine. The storm has passed. Yes, though it left enough snow to make travel treacherous for a day or two. She handed him a bowl of porridge enhanced with dried berries and nuts he hadn't even known he possessed. If you'll permit me to stay another night, I'll be able to continue my journey safely. Magnus found himself hoping she would ask for longer, then immediately questioned the impulse. One night of companionship shouldn't be enough to disturb 15 years of chosen solitude. Yet as he watched her efficient movements around his hall, the way she seemed to bring warmth to spaces he hadn't realized were cold, he felt something shifting in his carefully ordered world. Tell me about these dangerous men who pursue you, he said as they worked together to clear snow from around his hall. Astrid paused in her shoveling, her expression growing distant. My second husband was a good man, but he made enemies through his success in trade. When he died of fever last winter, those enemies saw opportunity in a widow left alone. And your first husband? Also good in his way. But he died young in a hunting accident that left me with 4 small children and debts I could not pay alone. She resumed her work with quick, efficient strokes. I married my second husband for protection as much as affection. He provided both, but his death returned me to vulnerability. There was more to the story. Magnus could sense it in the careful way she chose her words, the slight tension that entered her posture when speaking of her past. But he had his own secrets, his own careful omissions, and he recognized the boundaries she was setting. They worked in companionable silence, clearing paths and gathering firewood with the easy cooperation of people who understood the value of shared labor. Astrid proved surprisingly strong, her broad shoulders and sturdy frame well suited to physical work. As the day progressed, Magnus found himself stealing glances at his unexpected guest. She moved through his hall with growing familiarity, adjusting small things to improve their function, organizing supplies with an efficiency that spoke of years managing a household. Her presence should have felt intrusive, but instead it felt right. "Magnus," she said as evening approached, "may I ask you something personal?" "You may ask." "I cannot promise to answer. Why do you live alone? A man of your strength and skill could have his choice of positions: guard to a jarl, leader of a war band, farmer with his own lands and family." The question he had dreaded, posed with such gentle directness that deflection seemed impossible. Magnus set down the knife he had been using to pare vegetables for their evening meal. "I am not. I have never been suitable for family life." "What makes you unsuitable?" "You are kind, hard-working, clearly intelligent. You provide well for yourself and show generosity to strangers." "I am too large, too frightening." "Women." He struggled with words he had never spoken aloud. "Women see only the warrior, the giant who could break them without meaning to. They do not see a man who might be gentle, who might care for them tenderly." Astrid set down her own work and moved closer, studying his face with those deep, steady eyes. "You speak as one who has been hurt by such judgments. I speak as one who learned early that some men are meant to live alone. And yet you opened your door to me, a stranger in a storm. You gave me shelter, shared your food, worked beside me without question or demand for payment." She reached out and touched his hand, her fingers warm against his cold skin. "That does not sound like a man unsuitable for companionship." Her touch sent warmth racing up his arm and straight to his heart. When had anyone last touched him with kindness? When had anyone looked at him and seen something worth knowing rather than something to fear? "Astrid," he began, but found he had no words for the confusion of emotions her simple gesture had awakened. "I know something of being judged by appearance," she said softly. "Of being found wanting by those who see only the surface. My first husband married me for my father's lands, my second for my skills in managing household and trade. Neither ever looked at me the way you have been looking at me today. How have I been looking at you? Like a man who sees a woman, not a burden or a convenience, but a person worth knowing." Her hand was still on his, steady and warm. "When did you last have someone look at you the same way?" The answer was never, but Magnus could not force the word past his lips. Instead, he turned his hand palm up, letting her fingers rest against his calloused skin. "I am 40 years old," he said quietly, "and I have never. I know nothing of women, of love, of the things other men take for granted. And I am 36 years old, twice widowed, with 4 children and more scars than any woman should carry." She smiled, that warm expression that transformed her entire face. "Perhaps we are both exactly what the other needs. Someone who understands that perfection is not required for connection." That night, as they sat by the fire sharing stories of their pasts, Magnus began to understand that loneliness was not his natural state but a choice he had made from wounded pride and fear. And Astrid, watching this giant of a man handle a carved wooden horse with infinite tenderness, a child's toy he had whittled for himself in his youth, began to see that strength and gentleness could indeed coexist in the same heart. When she finally rose to seek her bed, she paused beside his chair and placed a soft kiss on his forehead. "Thank you, Magnus, for showing me that there are still men in this world who see women as people rather than possessions." As she settled into sleep, Magnus remained by the dying fire, one massive hand touching the spot where her lips had briefly rested. For the first time in 15 years, he allowed himself to imagine a future that included more than mere survival. The dangerous men who pursued Astrid would come, he was certain of it. But when they arrived, they would find not a lone widow to be claimed, but a woman under the protection of Magnus the Quiet, who was discovering that some things were indeed worth fighting for. Outside, snow began to fall again, but inside the timber hall, 2 souls who had thought themselves beyond love were learning that the heart's capacity for hope was far greater than either had dared believe. The next morning brought the sound of horses and the baying of hounds, distant but unmistakably approaching. Astrid's pursuers had found their trail. Magnus reached for his battle axe, feeling its familiar weight in his hands for the first time in 15 years. But now he lifted it not in rage or bloodlust, but in protection of something infinitely precious, the chance at love he had never dared hope to find. "Stay behind me," he told Astrid, his voice carrying the authority of the warrior he had once been. "We face this together," she replied, drawing her own blade. I am done running. As the sounds of pursuit grew closer, Magnus realized that his years of isolation had not been wasted. They had taught him the difference between fighting for glory and fighting for love. And love, he was discovering, made him stronger than he had ever been as a mere warrior. The men who came seeking to claim Astrid would learn that she was under the protection of a giant who had finally found something worth protecting with his life.